I hope you've enjoyed learning about Chinese painting in the story Inspiration from Bamboo. Today, we're going to be breaking down the important aspects of the text and looking at how we can create a summary of it in English to make it easier to understand and explain. Then, I'm going to have a conversation with my good friend Chris about the text. Chris, could you introduce yourself to us, please?
Sure. My name is Chris. Hi. I've been in China over 10 years, have a background in education, and I've been very interested in Chinese culture since I've arrived here.
Fantastic. So our story starts by introducing two characters. Su Shi, a literary giant of the Northern Song dynasty, and Wen Yuke, a man who was skilled at painting pictures of bamboo. As we are trying to condense this text into a summary, we can refer to them as the writer Su Shi and the painter Wen Yuke. Then we need to mention why the two of them met, where they met, and what was special about that place. So, we could begin our story by saying, one day the great writer Su Shi visited the painter Wen Yuke at his home to ask him to paint a picture of bamboo for him. Su Shi noticed that the house was surrounded by many kinds of bamboo. Next, we move on to the dialogue between Su Shi and Wen Yuke. The important points of this are that Su Shi tells Wen Yuke which plants he would like him to paint and states that they should move the desk outside so he can paint them more easily. In Wen Yuke's response, the key information to include is that he refused to move the desk and said that he didn't need to because he knew all the exact details of the plants in the garden. A nice way to express this in English is to say that he knows them like the back of his hand. Next in our summary, we need to talk about the result. Wen Yuke paints an extraordinary bamboo painting which Su Shi is very impressed by. Then, Wen Yuke goes on to give a detailed description of his painting method. As we are writing a summary, we don't need to include too much of this detail. We just need to state that he did it and maybe paraphrase his statement. Before one begins to paint, it is necessary to have a complete image in one's mind. Finally, we need to include the moral of the story. Su Shi tells Wen Yuke that he has bamboo in his breast, and this shows us that he was painting from his heart. Now let's try to summarize that briefly. One day, the great writer Su Shi visited the painter Wen Yuke at his home to ask him to paint a picture of bamboo for him. Su Shi noticed that the house was surrounded by many kinds of bamboo. Su Shi tells Wen Yuke which plants he would like him to paint and states that they should move the desk outside so he can paint them more easily. Wen Yuke refuses to move the desk because he says that he already knows all the plants in the garden like the back of his hand. He goes on to paint an extraordinary bamboo painting, which Su Shi is very impressed by, and describes his painting style by saying that to paint a great picture, you need to see the complete picture in your mind first. Su Shi tells Wen Yuke that he has bamboo in his breast, and this shows us that the painting was from his heart, not just from his eyes. So, Chris, what do you think of this text?
It was fascinating to read a story of somebody who was so dedicated to painting one subject. He seemed to have really dedicated himself to this one subject.
Yes, I think there are many great artists who do this. If you focus on one subject, you can truly become a master of it. Qi Baishi, for example, was a Chinese artist who is most famous for his vast number of paintings of shrimp.
Shrimp. I'll have to look out for those. I also liked a lot of the imagery in the text, particularly the description of being like a rabbit running to escape a pouncing hawk.
Yes.
It really brought colour to the description.
Did you have any questions about the text?
Well, there was one term in the text that I wasn't too sure about. What exactly is running script?
Okay, that's a good question. This is a style of Chinese calligraphy. In this style, the brush strokes are much more free-flowing. It is generally considered to be one of the most beautiful styles, but it can be a little tricky to read.
So the free-flowing nature of the characters represents the free-flowing nature of Wen Yuke's painting style.
Exactly. The text also mentions regular script. Regular script has much more clearly defined strokes, and for someone who is new to Chinese calligraphy, can be much easier to understand.
I see. So is the author saying that Wen Yuke was using different methods to capture different parts of the bamboo?
Yes, that's right. He instinctively knew which techniques to use to capture the image in his mind.
The text describes Su Shi as a literary giant. Could you tell us a little more about him, please?
Yes, he was a poet and a government official during the Northern Song dynasty. He is described as a literary giant because he was very skilled at writing in many different styles. Two of the biggest styles of poetry in ancient China were called shi and si. They have very different structures, but he was adept at writing both. In addition, he was also a gifted calligrapher and essayist. He is known for the sense of optimism in his works.
Oh, wow. I know that he is often known by another name, Su Dongpo. Why is that?
Well, in ancient China, people were known by a few names. They had their birth names, as well as honorific titles that they acquired throughout their lives.
I've got a question for you now. The text uses the phrase Chinese painting, unlike Western oil painting, pursues the spirit rather than the mere likeness of shape of the subject. So would you agree with that?
I certainly agree with it up to a point. Starting in the Renaissance, there was a real drive in European art to capture a realistic representation of the subject.
Can you give us some examples of that, please?
Sure. Well, the most well-known would be Leonardo da Vinci. He used his studies to create works that were much truer to life.
His studies?
Yes, he was a man who was extremely dedicated to learning. He applied the knowledge he had acquired to his painting. For example, he used his knowledge of perspective that he gained from his studies of mathematics to show realistic depth in his paintings. And he used his knowledge of the anatomy to give realistic musculature to his human subjects.
How did he get such a great knowledge of anatomy?
Well, that's a slightly grisly story. He actually did it by performing autopsies on dead bodies. He wasn't a doctor. He just had a real commitment to his learning, and he did it in his spare time.
Yikes. That is real commitment. You said you agreed with the sentence to some extent. What did you mean by that?
Well, one of the biggest movements in Western art began in the 19th century. This movement was called Impressionism. Artists such as Monet, Renoir, and Degas rejected the conventions of the time and moved away from trying to create hyper-realistic representations and used loose, quick brushwork to try and represent the spirit of the subject rather than just imitate it.
Oh, that sounds very similar to what we've been talking about with Wen Yuke. How influential was the Impressionist movement?
Well, it really opened the door for many new art movements, such as Cubism.
Can you tell us a little bit about Cubism?
It was a movement that really broke away from realistic representation of the subject. The artists used geometric shapes to try and capture the essence of what they were looking at. Probably the most famous artist from this period was Pablo Picasso. His works can be quite challenging, and for many people, it is very much an acquired taste.
Well, thank you very much, Chloe. This has been a great discussion about art. It is a very complicated subject, but also very rewarding. It's really helpful to get some insight into the methods and approaches that great artists have used when creating their masterpieces.
No problem. Well, that's a bye from me, and also a goodbye from Chris.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.